Ratified in 1781, the Articles of Confederation served as the United States' first form of government. It was our first constitution. Remember, we just got rid of the king. We had to try to govern ourselves. We were starting a country from scratch, so that's where the Articles of Confederation came in. So it was developed during the end of the Revolution, and really what it needed to do was just create the powers that would be our new national government. But the issue is, because we just had a strong government that we just overthrew, when developing the Articles, we actually developed a weak national government. As you can see in this picture here, the states had way more power than the federal government. Poor Uncle Sam. Okay, each state had its own state government, just like today, but the big issue really was that they had more power than the national government, and there was only one branch of the federal government, the legislative branch, what we call Congress today. There was no executive branch, so no president, and there was no judicial branch like our Supreme Court to look at laws. Also, each state only had one vote in Congress, no matter how big or small it was. So a small state like Rhode Island would have as much say in voting as Virginia. And at times, that's fine. But then there are other times where it might not be good to have the same amount of votes. For instance, if there was a law that was passed that had to do with, population, and the more population it would have, a state would have, the more, funding, or the more something could happen with the state, right? A large state like Virginia would be all for it, whereas a small state like Rhode Island would be against it because it wouldn't have as big of a population. So it's not necessarily fair that that small state of Rhode Island could pass or not pass, a law that would limit the things that could benefit Virginia. So that's just an example, just a made-up one that I could think of off the top of my head. So under the Articles of Confederation, the national government, or in other words, Congress, could decide to go to war. They could operate post offices, which is good for communicating between the states. They could make money, but there was no common currency. Each state had their own form of currency. So it's almost like today with traveling to another country, almost like there's an exchange rate. So if you were living in Virginia at the time and you wanted to travel up to New York to visit family or maybe start a business, I don't know, and you brought your money from Virginia, you're going to probably end up spending more for items in New York than you would in Virginia, just because the people in New York wouldn't necessarily want the Virginian money. So that's kind of a problem. And then also under the Articles, the U.S. could make treaties with other countries, which is always a plus, okay? But hold on. Under the Articles of Confederation, the national government or Congress could not collect or levy taxes. Well, why is that such a big deal if we just fought a war that kind of started based on taxes? Well, taxes, believe it or not, do help pay for things in our government. I don't like paying them. Our other teachers here don't like paying them. Your parents probably don't like paying them. However, they do contribute towards things to make improvements. For instance, certain jobs are paid for by taxes, or repaving roads come from tax money. Those are just a couple of examples. So even though people might not like them, they are used for different things. And the Articles of Confederation had no way of collecting taxes from the people at all. So that's a big issue because it's not going to be able to get any money. And without that money, it couldn't pay the soldiers that fought in the American Revolution. That's going to be an issue later on, so just hold on with that thought. The national government also could not settle arguments between states. So if there were trade disputes between different states, things going across lines, the national government had to just kind of watch the states settle it for themselves and they could not intervene in any way. So essentially, it could not make the states do what it wanted them to do. They had a free-for-all. They had way more power than the national government. Okay, all these issues, along with this event, is going to cause a lot of concern for leaders in our government. This event is called Shays' Rebellion, and it started after the American Revolution, when those former soldiers that were farmers, they couldn't pay local taxes. It says pay taxes, but they couldn't pay local taxes because they didn't have enough money. Okay, remember, they weren't being paid for serving in the army during the war because the government had no way of collecting money for them to pay them. So they lost their farms, or perhaps they were put in jail. So in Massachusetts, a former soldier who, by the name of Daniel Shay, he was very upset about this. He organized around 1,000 followers that were equally upset, and they were going to start a little rebellion, a little riot. And because the government could not actually regulate a national army, that's another flaw of the system, the government had to ask Massachusetts to step in. Okay, so Daniel Shay and hundreds of men, I would say probably closer to around 1,000, they got their weapons and they tried to stop the courts from taking people's property. It became known as Shays' Rebellion. So, like I said, the national government asked Massachusetts to step in, and the Massachusetts militia had to be organized to put them down. So there's no national army, there's no force that could just be called in. The national government essentially had to ask Massachusetts to put a stop to this. So, another reason why the states had way more power than the national government. So in conclusion, the Articles of Confederation was really a bad form of government, which is why it only lasted a handful of years. It created a very weak national government. The states had way too much power. It had no way of getting money from the people. Like I said, it couldn't raise a national army. So we could go to war against another country, but we just had to ask local militias to try to organize, and they ultimately had the deciding factor. So, the Articles, really bad, and that's why there was going to eventually become known as the Constitutional Convention. They were going to see if they could fix the Articles, and upon doing so, they realized that the Articles was so bad that they just really needed to start over. So that's where we go next with the Constitutional Convention.